There's a question that was asked recently from the scripture, of course, and as we do time to time, we get to respond to questions from the Bible. And the question is about what we find in the scripture, especially in connection to marriage. And so, of course, you look at Abraham. Abraham had more than one wife. He had Sarah, but then he ended up with Agar at one point. We see David with more than one wife. We see Solomon with over 700 wives, 700 and 300 concubines. You could pull the list over and over, at least in the scripture. And the question was, we see that all of these men were polygamous in a way, one form or another, but that's yet somehow God seemed to have favored them. That was the question. Does it mean God is okay with polygamy or not okay with polygamy? And if so, why would he favor these men who definitely were polygamous? And that's a very good question because it helps us go back to the scripture. And I want to point out of the many things we could point out, I'm just going to point out two of them. And one is that everything that we see that's happened in the scripture, how God has treated people in history recorded for us in the Bible, including how he treats us today, is completely out of his grace, not because of our merit, our good deeds, our good character and good behavior and anything that springs from us. An example would be with Abraham. He was a pagan idol worshiper when God called him. And so God calls him not because he was better than the rest of the people of his time, but because God was gracious and merciful. And so God calls a pagan and turns him into the worshiper of a true God. We see that when he fell into the sin of adultery with Agar, we see God forgives him, not because he was better than the rest, but because God was merciful. We can look at all of those with David and Solomon and all the list of the names that you could pull out. However, even though we see that God is gracious and God is merciful, we see one thing is also true, and that is the consequences. That even when God will forgive us, we have to bear the consequences. Abraham definitely had to deal with the consequence of his action, and yes, God forgave him, and yes, God still used him, just like all of us today. For every believer who is here now, none of us can say we are here right now and doing what we do for the kingdom because we are 100% perfect, because we are sinless. It's because God is gracious and merciful. But what is very true also is that we have to bear the consequence. And so Abraham's action and sin, although forgiven, came with consequences, came with a divided family, and came with all the chaos that the world is in today. We see Ishmael and the Ishmaelites, and Isaac and the Israelites becoming two different nations opposed to each other and in fight up until now. Forgiven, consequences brought more problem. David the same. We see as a result of it, his family is divided. His sons and children turned against him and tried to overthrow him, and then there's chaos that ensues all through. We could pull Jacob as well. We see the chaos in his own family, the division and the chaos in his own family. Solomon ends up having his heart turned away from God and being plunged completely into idolatry and idol worship. And the Bible tells us because his foreign women turned his heart away from God. And so all of these things, so why is it recorded in the Bible? Well, let me say two things before we read a scripture. At the end of it is, now, descriptions in the Bible are not oftentimes prescription. Just because it is recorded in the Bible, it is not presenting how things should be. And therefore, narrative as it's presented always, is not always normative. Just because it is narrated and included in scripture does not mean it's saying that is how things should be. All right. Now, with that said, God is gracious and he forgives us just like he's forgiven them. But we have to be willing to bear the consequences of our actions. And we've seen for all the different people we can pull through in the scripture, we see evidently that they all had to deal with the result of the sinfulness. And Jesus in Matthew chapter 19, when he was asked about marriage, and of course at that point divorce and separation and multiple union marriages, Jesus says all of this has happened because of the hardness of our hearts. It's not God's plan, not God's design. It is the hardness of our hearts. So Jesus points them back and says, well, it was not so from the beginning. When you look at God's plan for marriage, God's order of creation and God's design says in the beginning it was not so. In the beginning, he created one man and one woman, and that was supposed to be the plan. Okay. Now, why are these things written there for? Well, one, the beauty with God is it doesn't hide things. And that's the beauty with the Bible. If the Bible is just man trying to create something beautiful about God and just hide and make up things, some of these things would not be written because it'll show the flaws in people and the system. So now I want to read this passage that hopefully will help us. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul draws our attention to the examples and the life of the Israelites. And you remember, you notice that all of the questions, all the characters brought out in this question were Jews and therefore from the Israelite nation. And he gives this warning. I do not want you, brothers. So 1 Corinthians chapter 10 from verse 11. Well, let me read verse 1 and then I'll jump to verse 5. It says, I do not want you, brothers, let's just read everything, to be unaware that our fathers, and so this is Paul, who is a Jew as well, our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And he's talking about how God redeemed them and made them pass through the Red Sea. That's what he's dealing with. And all ate the same spiritual food and all drank from the same spiritual rock. This spiritual drink, they drank from this rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. And so he's already pointing to something, a type, and says the water they were able to get through this rock was provided by Christ. The food, the manna and the quill they were able to get was because God through Christ was providing for them. And so already showing that Christ was existent even in the Old Testament. He did not begin being present. The Son of God did not begin being present with the incarnation. Well, so it says, nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased. Okay, why was God not pleased with them? And they were thrown. Verse 6 is very important. It helps us understand the heart of this question. These things took place as example for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. The things that happened to them that has been recorded took place as an example that we might not desire evil as they did. And here are a few examples that it points out. Do not be idolaters as some of them did in verse 7. And then of course there was a consequence for idolatry. Verse 8, do not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did. And of course there were consequences. Verse 9, we must not put Christ to the test like some of them did and they were destroyed. There were consequences. We should not grumble, verse 10, as some of them did and they were destroyed by the destroyer. So we could pull over and over again. But why? Verse 11, these things happen to them as an example. But why has it been written down? Well, it's been written down for our instruction on whom the end of the age has come. Therefore, let anyone who think he stands take heed lest he falls. So, Paul summarizes it this way. The things recorded, what we see, for example, with the story about Abraham and Agar and David and Bathsheba and Solomon and his numerous wives and all of those different characters, says it happened to them, but it's been written down for our warnings. So look at when Abraham fell in that sin, what consequence did he had to go through, and what happened to his family, and by extension affecting the entire humanity. When David sinned and went into multiple wives, what did that do to him and to his family, and how did it affect the nation? Well, partly we see it leads to the division of the kingdom. When Solomon got into multiple wives, what happened? The dividing of the kingdom, the 10 tribes being by themselves, and eventually the destruction of the northern kingdom, 10 tribes gone. And we could pull all of the, so it happened to them, written now for our warning, that we should not, just because they live that life, should not desire to live that life, because God, even though He's gracious and merciful, will not let us get away with it. There's consequences for it. And so a wise person will learn from the mistakes of others. They've lived this life. God did not condone it, not just say let it happen, but because of their hardness of heart and went through it, we see that God teaching them and pointing them that dealt with the consequences so that other people can learn from it. And now it is written for our instruction. So hopefully that we will not make the same mistakes they did. Because like Jesus said, if we go back to understanding God's purpose and the beginning of everything, that was not so with God's design in the first place. And so we get back to God's design and not follow in the path of those who were disobedient to Him, so that we don't experience the same consequences of what they experienced. These things happened to them as an example, but it's been written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the age has come. I hope this has helped with the question that you had. And I pray that God bless you as you continue reading and studying the scripture, and that God will bless your effort in it as well.